Okay, now I want to discuss a pretty specific type of factoring called factoring by grouping. And this doesn't actually work very often, but first you need a polynomial with 4 terms, sometimes more, but most of the time it'll just be 4 terms. And this is how you can see if you can factor by grouping. The first thing you do is you sort of in your head group those first 2 terms together. 2x cubed minus 6x squared. And see what you can factor out of just those 2 terms. So both of those 2 terms have an x squared that you can factor out, and both of these terms also have a 2 that you can factor out because 6 and 2 are both divisible by 2. So I'm going to do all of that at once. I'm going to take out a 2x squared just from those 2 terms, forgetting about these last 2 for a moment. Well, if we're going to pull a 2x squared out of 2x cubed, what are we left with? Just an x. If you're going to pull a 2x squared out of a negative 6x squared, you're actually just left with a 3. And you can verify that that's true by imagining what would happen if you multiplied the 2x squared back through the parentheses. You get what you started with. Now, see what you can factor out of the last 2 terms. It looks to me like you can pull a 3 out of both terms. You can't pull an x out of both terms because there's not an x here, but it looks like you can pull a 3 out of both terms. If you pulled a 3 out of the first term, you'd just be left with the x, and if you pull a 3 out of negative 9, you're left with a negative 3. Now if we add this blue thing and this green thing together, we have exactly what we started with, and you can verify that that's the case by multiplying the 2x squared through and the 3 through the parentheses. You'll see you get what you started with. Now this is how you can tell if you can even factor this by grouping. If you can factor this polynomial by grouping, then the term you get in parentheses here and the term you get in parentheses here will be exactly the same. If those aren't the same, then you can't factor this by grouping. In this case, fortunately, the things in parentheses are exactly the same. So this is where it gets a little bit interesting. Notice you have an x minus 3, that is a factor in your first term, and you have an x minus 3 as a factor in the second term. Since this x minus 3 factor appears in each one of our 2 terms, we can factor it out of each term. So if we factor an x minus 3 out of the first term, just this first term here, we're left with a 2x squared. That's what's left. If we factor an x minus 3 out of the second term, all we're left with is a 3, a positive 3. I know it looks a little bit magical, but that is factoring by grouping. That is the answer. You can verify that if you multiply the thing in the box back out. If you FOIL it back out, you should get just what we started with. Let's try one more. Okay, we're going to try to factor this by grouping the same way we did with the last example. So we're going to look at those first 2 terms first and ask what can we factor out of both of those terms. Well, there's a 2, it looks like we can factor out of both of those terms. And there's an x squared that appears in each one of these terms that we can take out. And the question is, what are we left with? Well, we're left with an x plus 12 divided by 2 is 6, and that's it. Now, what can we factor out of the last 2 terms? Well, it looks like there's a negative sign on both of them, so we can factor a negative sign out of each of them. We can take a 5 out of both of them as well, because 5 and 30 are both divisible by 5. So we can actually pull a negative 5 out of each of those last 2 terms. If we pull a negative 5 out of negative 5x, you're just left with an x. And if you pull a negative 5 out of negative 30, you're left with a positive 6. And now you'll notice that the x plus 6, the term in parentheses, is the same on each one of those 2 terms. So we can factor x plus 6 out of each one of these 2 terms. X plus 6, and what are we left with? Well, if you factor it out of the first term, the only thing that's left is the 2x squared. And if you factor it out of the second term, the only thing that's left is this minus 5. And that is how you factor by grouping. Again, it doesn't always work because the thing in parentheses here has to be the same for it to work. But when it does work, it works pretty quickly. Okay, video quiz time. See if you can factor this one right here by grouping. Good luck, and I'll see you in class.